Hello, this is Mark Bassingthwaite. I'm the risk manager here at ALPS. Welcome to another episode of ALPS in Brief, the podcast that comes to you from the historic Florence building in beautiful downtown Missoula, Montana. I'm delighted to be able to introduce just a very special guest today. I'm very privileged and excited to have the opportunity to speak with Brian Cuban. Brian is, I would assume, is known to some of you. He's the younger brother of Dallas Mavericks owner and entrepreneur Mark Cuban. But more importantly, Brian is a Dallas-based attorney, author, and addiction recovery addict. He is a graduate of Penn State University and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Brian, I am interested in visiting with you in no small part because of the a more recent book, The Addicted Lawyer, Tales of the Bar, Booze, Blow, and Redemption. And it's my understanding you've done quite a bit of speaking on this topic of addiction and recovery, not only throughout the United States, but I believe internationally, if I'm not incorrect.
That is correct. And one small correction.
Yes.
Addiction recovery advocate, not addict. I've been recovering and have been for 7 years.
Good catch. My mea culpa there. It's
That's
the
okay.
tongue.
That's okay.
Maybe can we briefly just start out having you, for those that don't know your story, can you share for our listeners a little bit about your story?
Sure. Well, let's start out with I've been in recovery for 11 and a half years from alcohol, cocaine, and from an eating disorder, bulimia.
Mm-hmm.
My drinking started in high school. It progressed through law school. It got a lot worse in law school, and I discovered cocaine when I moved to Dallas in a bathroom in a hotel in Dallas, and it was Katie barred the door. And I became heavily addicted to cocaine and alcohol. 3 failed marriages, one more I get a free set of steak knives. And they all failed relating to drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
2 trips to a psychiatric facility and near suicide in 2005. Finally finding recovery. I failed the bar exam twice, both failures relating to my being more interested in drugs and alcohol than practicing law. An interesting little anecdote from that, I tell. The first time I took the Texas bar exam, my study aids were a fifth of Jack Daniels, an 8 ball of cocaine, which is 3.5 ounces, a liter of tab, and some Barbary books I'd gotten that same day. Needless to say, I didn't pass.
Right, yeah. Wow. I'd love to hear, I mean, this is pretty heavy use. And it's my word would be, you've really seen some dark places in terms of how I hear your story. When I think about others that are in various stages of addiction and dealing with challenges, I think one of the problems that people face, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but there's this fear of what others will say. If, for instance, if I'm struggling with something, if I say, okay, I have an alcohol problem, or I have a mental illness, or I have some other type of addiction, that people are going to view me as perhaps weak, unable to cut it, these kinds of things. In other words, there are social stigmas in play. At least we fear that. I think people at times even feel very shameful, personally, about having these kinds of struggles. And may I ask, how did you personally find the strength to pull out of all of this, to move forward, not caring perhaps? I'm not sure of the social stigmas, but what was the strength? What enabled you to come out the other side of this?
That's a great question. And the answer is complex, but to simplify it down, my quote-unquote aha moment was standing in the parking lot of a Dallas psychiatric facility for my second time, and at that moment realizing that I was probably going to lose my family if I did not find recovery. And there is really there's my wife, there's my family, and nothing is more important to me than family.
Yes.
And I wasn't going to lose their love, but family's distance, because they have nieces, they have their children, my nieces and nephews. They don't want someone who's high on cocaine and drunk hanging around them, and so distancing occurs. And families realize, look, there's this gray area between love, enablement, and recovery, where does enablement end and recovery begin? And I think that it all finally come together, and I realized that standing in that parking lot. And that was the moment where I said, okay, I need to take that first scary step forward and risk the stigma. Because if I don't, not only will there not be a third trip back, because I'll probably be dead, but I will lose everything that is dear to me. Why that happened in April 2007, in that moment, and not say in the summer of 2005, where my brother came into my house and I had a weapon on my nightstand, I was going to take my own life, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That moment is different for everyone, but that is what was going through my mind at that time.
So what I hear you saying, and I think this is a wonderful message, and am I correct that you got to a point where you say, at some point I realized my family, the people that are in my life, are simply more important to me than getting high. Is it that? I think it's more complex than that. But
it's more complex, but I can tell you that was the trigger at that moment.
Okay.
When we talk about everything that came before that, you have to talk about trauma, you have to talk about childhood, there was a lot of bullying, there was my relationships at home. Yeah. And we have to remember that when I talk to lawyers and I talk to law students about the struggling they are facing in that moment, nothing happens in a vacuum. I've had lawyers and law students tell me, and I am the first person they've ever told, about bullying, about childhood trauma, about sexual abuse, about physical abuse. And of course, I am not qualified to talk to them about those issues. I have resources that I refer them to, like the Lawyers Assistance Program, if they need a specific counselor. I have places I send them. But there is a much bigger, there is the trigger in that moment, and then there is everything that got us to that moment. Does that make sense?
It does. Absolutely, it does. Let me kind of take this a little further in a different way. I see, again, in I'm a lawyer, I'm a tech geek, I'm not a physician, I'm not trained in drug counseling and these kinds of things. But
neither am I.
But my limited understanding of addictions is that a lot of these behaviors get their start, and then I think become cemented because people will turn to whatever drug of choice it is as a coping mechanism. It, for instance, masks the pain or masks the fear, whatever it might be. And now, being 11 plus years into recovery, you just like everybody else, we continue to have challenges and struggles in life and these kinds of things. What have you done in terms of replacing an unhealthy coping mechanism, looking at alcohol or cocaine as an example? How do you deal now? What is the healthy way? How are you coping?
That's a great question, and let's deal with a current real-life example. I am not disclosing this for people to feel sad, but it's life and death is real. My father died 2 weeks ago today. Oh. My father died 2 weeks ago today at 92 years old, and we were very, very close. I was just at the cemetery visiting him before this podcast. That is trauma, right?
Yes, it is.
That is something that 12 years ago, I absolutely would have turned to cocaine, gone out and gotten hammered, done who knows what in order to mask that pain. But I learned that doing that to mask that pain, one, is not going to bring my father back.
Yes.
Two, is going to set me on a path that he wouldn't want, that my family wouldn't want, that will end up with me back at that psychiatric facility or dead. So I had to learn to deal with trauma on life's own terms, whether that's the passing of a loved one, whether that is the passing whether that is the bullying of my childhood, whether that is any type of thing that we try to mask, right? You go into a high school and you talk to students who were smoking weed or all kinds of polymorphous drug use, and you ask them why, they may not be able to articulate it, but they're masking, right? They're masking pain, they're masking rejection, they're masking the need to be acceptance, and that starts in high school, and this need to use a substance to mask goes on through law school, through college, through law school, through into our law practice. So what did I learn that moment in 2007? Well, I learned that I needed support. The support, my first support was 12-step.
Okay.
I am not promoting 12-step. I am not saying that is the way for everyone. But it wasn't even a way that I particularly wanted to embrace. But I knew I had to take some step, and I needed support, and I needed to be able to be with people who understood exactly what I was going through. So I walked into that alcohol-based 12-step, and Alcoholics Anonymous is the most well-known of those.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that was April 8, 2007. And so 12-step has been one of my ways. And the first thing I did, other than relying on the love of my family when my father passed, I went to a 12-step meeting. That is how I cope. And I'm also in counseling. I have been seeing a psychiatrist for 15 years.
Yeah. I find this a very positive message of hope, because what I hear you saying is, or how I'm responding to what you're saying is, as an addict, you make this choice to fall back on something that numbs, that masks, that hides the pain, and all these kinds of things. But now you realize and you identify the same problems that might send you there, but you realize you have choices and you have people that can be supportive, because no one is expected to go through and should have to go through all kinds of, you're not alone, in other words. And I think in the world of addiction, from again, what I hear and understand is this loneliness thing is very central and is in part something that drives the poor decision making. But you've come
Absolutely.
and you've come out this other side and support and I love the message. Can we assume?
I also want to be careful in how we frame choice.
Yes. Okay. Please.
There's this saying that addiction, and I believe in the disease model. Some people don't, I do. Addiction is not a choice, but recovery is. Recovery is about choices, okay?
Yes.
And people get kind of caught up in this, and it is a very kind of volatile issue. If you ask me, was the first time I did a line of cocaine a choice? Of course it was a choice. I chose to do it. Now, it was a choice influenced by a lot of childhood trauma and a lot of self-loathing issues, a lot of issues on how I viewed myself, but it was a choice. But when I did that line of cocaine and suddenly for the first time in my life for 15 seconds, looked in the mirror and finally loved myself, a process that took over in my brain that told me I needed to do that again and again and again to continue to love myself was not a choice.
Yes.
That is the difference. So I want to be sure we frame choice properly.
Well, and I appreciate it, and I absolutely agree with you and understand. I think that's a very important point to make. Can we sort of assume for a moment that somebody is listening to this podcast that may have some level of addiction, some struggle, and is sort of responding to this, well, this is kind of interesting, but it doesn't apply to me. I don't really have a problem. Counselors are for, they're all trying to fix themselves. They don't know what they're doing. There's head games. You see where I'm trying to go, that there's all kinds of excuses. We can come up with all kinds of excuses not to try to acknowledge that we have a problem. And people can get, for lack of a better term, I think, stuck. And at times stuck for years. And that's where I presume some distancing comes into play and all kinds of things. What would you say to this individual?
That for the most part, the odds of it going away are on its own are slim. That it's only going to get worse. This is proven out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, addiction is a progressive disease. That it is okay to reach out to someone to seek help.
Okay.
I would encourage that person to take a real life stock of what's going on in their life, day-to-day life. How is your relationship with your wife? How is your relationship with your children? How is your relationship with your partners at the law firm or your friends? What is actually going on in your life? Write it down. Because when I get along, I'm high functioning. There is no such thing as high functioning. Okay? Yeah. There is only a degree of decline of functioning. And the biggest issue I see in the legal profession, because we don't like to be vulnerable, is waiting for the consequences to catch up to the problem. Are you going to take stock of it now and at least take one step forward to make your life just a little bit better, however you define that outside of drugs and alcohol? Whether it's your wife, whether it's your children, whether it's what's going on at work. Are you going to do that, or are you going to wait for the consequences to eventually catch up to what's going on as it gets progressively worse? And that will happen, and all of a sudden it's divorce. All of a sudden it's malpractice. All of a sudden it's a bar complaint.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're facing suspension, disbarment. All of a sudden you are unemployed. Why wait for that?
Yeah.
Take that first step now. Call your lawyer's assistance program. It's confidential.
Yes. And I really appreciate your sharing that idea. I think so many people are a little bit afraid of talking to these various lawyer assistance programs, because there is this fear that there's going to be some it's going to get out. These are confidential situations in terms of communications and whatnot. And my experience in terms of the people that are involved in running these programs are just down to earth, rock solid, good people that have been there.
And you know what? No matter how much I say it, there's going to be a demographic of lawyers who aren't going to use them because they are just convinced in their mind. We don't have enough time, but I will tell you a funny anecdote about that. That are just convinced in their mind that they are an arm of the state bar, they are not confidential, and it's going to get out. Let me tell you what is not confidential. Is when you wait for the consequences to catch up to the problem, and that's your name in the back pages of your bar journal.
You are so right, and I love that. But that's the reality. That's what's coming if this isn't addressed. You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. Well, listen, Brian, I really appreciate your taking the time today to share a bit of your story and to spend a little time here with me on the podcast. It really has been a pleasure, and I hope at some point to have another opportunity. You're the kind of guy I'd love to just sit down and enjoy a nice glass of Italian sparkling water or something, and just have a nice meal and some great conversation. That would be just wonderful.
Let me end with one more thing.
Yes, please.
Any lawyer or even a law student who may listen to this who is struggling out there, but think they're coping. Okay, I'm coping. I'm doing okay.
Right.
Ask your wife if you're doing okay. Ask your children if you're doing okay. Ask your partner if you're doing okay. Ask an associate if you're doing okay. Ask a friend of yours if you're doing okay. You may get a different answer than you think.
Yeah. And then have the courage to listen.
And have the courage to listen. And you have to be able to drop that wall and be ready for the response. Because dropping the wall of allowing yourself to be vulnerable is one of the hardest things we can do in the legal profession, because we're trained to take advantage of that, right? In our profession, to some extent.
That's right.
It's not something we allow ourselves to do, to self-explore.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's solid advice. Well, we are out of time here. I do want to say to all of you listening in, I hope you found something of value in today's conversation. Please feel free to reach out anytime if any of you listeners have any thoughts in terms of topics or other folks that you'd like to listen to in terms of have them join us on the podcast. Thanks for listening, and have a good one. Bye-bye.